Atlantic School of Theology, partial fulfillment of the Masters of Divinity program in the distance education program at the Atlantic School of Theology. I'm a candidate in the United Church of Canada. My name is Gavin Williams, and I thank you for the time today. First, a note on where we are, our setting, our context. This is North Bromley United Church, and I owe them a debt of gratitude for making time for this project and letting me use their excellent facility. I kind of want to bring attention to it because my project's title, Life After Church, has the subtitle, What the Lived Experience of Social Disconnection Can Teach the Church. Many congregations are facing decline and closure at this time. It is a time of uncertainty, not just in the United Church of Canada, but also in mainline denominations as a whole. And North Bromley is a place that is thriving and growing. So if you come out of this presentation with any concerns, questions, doubts about the future, if you have curiosity and hope about best practices, about things that can help make a community thrive, strategies and stances that work, this is one of the places to ask. Jamie Holtum is the lead pastor here. He was my youth minister growing up in Oshawa for a year during his internship, kind of doing what I'm doing now, and he was a candidate for ordination. He was the first ordination I ever saw, and he's written a book with his preaching partner, Debbie Johnson, called Bullseye, that looks at the things that a congregation can target to change their culture, to get themselves excited about sharing the gospel. So I wanted to do this presentation in this context because it's a balance point for those feelings of hopelessness and despair. There are people that can help. And so I'm just grateful for their mentoring and the time they've put into this project with me. So as I said, this is a qualitative research project. For some people, that might be an unfamiliar term. I know it was unfamiliar for me when I first started. We were probably, all of us, more familiar with quantitative research that has to do with numbers, measurements, statistics. Those things are in the newspaper and in the news all the time. Qualitative research is a little bit different. It looks at human lived experience, whether culturally, in groups, or with individuals. My project took a phenomenological approach, which means I looked at a common human experience, in this case, what it's like to live through a congregation closing, and I did interviews with 6 subjects between the ages of 35 and 70 that had all belonged to a United Church in Canada, primarily in southwestern Ontario, at 3 different locations. So they don't necessarily know each other or been through the same things, but they've been through the same human experience. And what we look for in phenomenology is what's the concrete, not concrete, but more like the abstract essence of the experience. How can we look for a thick description and look at where things overlap in themes to determine what people would naturally just go through and have in common about this, so that it would become a comprehensible experience instead of something that just happened to an individual and they didn't know it connected to others. What are the connections that we can make? So, life after church, what the lived experience of social disconnection during congregational closure can teach us. The reason for this project, the thing that came up, was that at annual meetings with the region, and before that the conference or the presbytery, certainly at school, conference education student committee meetings, things like that, I would hear this anecdote. It was said so often by so many people, it was taken as a fact, but nobody ever cited a source to back it up. People would say that the United Church of Canada closes a congregation every month. And I said, that seems like a lot. Like, but how do we know that that's the fact? So I dug into to that idea and looked for data. For some of us, this might be history that we know. For others, it might be a surprise. I know I didn't know it when I first showed up, but I've studied history since. The United Church of Canada was founded in 1925. It is fairly young as a denomination goes. It's not even 100 years old yet, but it was formed on the foundation of 4 other denominations. There were union churches that were kind of anticipating the United Church coming into existence. There were Congregationalists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. And because it was built on the historical foundation of other denominations, the United Church actually started quite large. It started with 600,000 members. So that's 1925. By 1964, so almost 40 years later, it had peaked at 1.1 million members. So it had almost doubled in size. But according to our own yearbook statistics in the United Church of Canada, that number has declined ever since to 400,000 by 2017. Fewer than that actually attend on Sundays, but that number is even scarier. 400,000 members by 2017 is what we track in our own statistics. People might say, like, how do we lose 700,000 people? That seems like a mass exodus. You would notice if people left that fast. Without going into historical detail of year over year, if we just average out that number, more than 13,000 people would be leaving the United Church a year. That's over 1,000 a month. And that's certainly more than a congregation a month. There are very few congregations that are 1,000 people in size. So it seems like that would be an abrupt shift. That would be a mass kind of everybody just exiting the building. But that's probably not how it happened. Just statistically, there are close to 2,700 different congregations today in the United Church of Canada, at 2,100 different locations. But if that used to be closer to 3,000 because we've been closing them for a while, if you had 3,000 congregations, a congregation could have a net loss of one member every 4 months for a total of about 4 a year. And I mean net loss, so say you baptized 2, but you lost 6, whether to death or to departure. If you have a net loss of 4 a year, it doesn't look like very much in one location, but over the 50 years that we've been declining, that would be 200 people that haven't been replaced. They've been outpaced by exits and deaths, even if we've had some baptisms, even if we've had some professions of faith. This isn't true of every church, but if that's the average loss, that's how we lost 700,000 people over the last half century. However, this isn't unique to the United Church of Canada. Other mainline denominations are experiencing a similar demographic shift, and even volunteer organizations report less participation, whether it's the Rotary Club, the Optimists, organizations like that. Our entire society has seemed to be less inclined to social connection and to social grouping. Some people cite cell phones and internet being a disruptive technology that makes it easier for us to act as individuals outside of our geographic sphere. We make friends online with digital social networks instead of physical ones, and that's certainly part of the factor. But I would suggest that there's a different paradigm that's affecting the Western culture. Amy Banks, in the article Developing the Capacity to Connect, looks at that paradigm of individualism, of corporate capitalism, that I need to strive in this weird form of social Darwinism to compete, to outcompete everyone else, to be an individual with my own agency, but not caring what happens to others, because I need to be rich and famous and successful at their cost. That's kind of our cultural dynamic. She calls that the American dream. It certainly affects Canada and Western Europe as well, but the American dream is kind of, typifies this idea, and she suggests that dream has become an existential nightmare. So this is quoting directly from Amy Banks. According to this dream, the tired masses have a shot at making on their own if they have the willpower, stamina, and intestinal fortitude to survive and compete. What do we do now that we are faced with scientific evidence that this very strategy is driving society into disconnection, despair, and even poor health? Relational cultural theory states that growth happens through and toward relationships, not toward increased separation and autonomy. So this is just my analysis of that. Through the lens of relational cultural theory and psychology, Banks is indicating that the societal forces that highlight individualism as a cultural ideal are fracturing relational connection. Isolation causes poor physical and mental health. We know that. We've studied it. Whether it's sought after as a dream or forced upon us by someone else. So whether we want that for ourselves or whether someone else forces us into that situation, the outcome is the same. It releases us into a space of being fractured physically and mentally. It's not healthy to exist by ourselves. So what our society is basically experiencing is an uprooting, where they're disconnected from their known context and their social group around them. So it's kind of like pulling a plant out of its environment. Any plant pulled out of its environment is going to wither. You could put flowers in a vase on your table, but eventually they're going to die because they need their environment to actually thrive and survive. We can't exist as individuals separate from our context. And so to turn towards the research that I did with interviewees, members of actually United Churches that have closed, they cited themselves that this has been their ongoing experience. They said, Eaton's has closed, Sears is on its way out, we're sure the Hudson Bay is next. The buildings that they grew up with are being torn down and replaced with new ones. Cars drive faster. They went from party lines and rotary phones to cellular networks of fast connection, but you see people less. They feel like the whole world has kind of become chaotic and swirling. It's disorienting, and they don't know how to necessarily land softly in a place and start over, emotionally, socially. And what that's like when their congregation closes is kind of more frightening. congregations in a lot of settings, particularly rural ones, have sometimes existed for 150 to 175 years. Some of our congregations are actually older than Canada. And so people's parents, grandparents, great-grandparents have been in that setting, and they have a huge sentimental connection emotionally to those spaces. So when they lose that institution, an institution that seemed permanent, they're really greatly disoriented by it. So the core, the essence of the experience, everyone I interviewed described it as if they had lost someone they cared about, as if they were experiencing a death. Some people expressed it as an extended family member. Some people said as a close friend. A few, something as intimate as losing a parent. But it took an emotional toll. They would cry, they would bawl, they would feel off kilter, off balance, destabilized, disoriented, unhinged. The most apt description was a woman who pointed out why it felt to her like losing a parent. She compared it to losing her mother. It is a place of nurture, unconditional love. It's a place where values were instilled, where skills were acquired, where they felt always encouraged, and there's a lot of affection. No place felt safer than church except for her mother. And so to lose her church was equivalent to her, to re-experiencing her mother's death. Beyond that, another interviewee pointed out what kind of death it is. So the death of a congregation is not an abrupt death. It's not an accident. It's not a murder. It's not like a brain aneurysm. It's not sudden. It's a very gradual process that you watch in real time. And it's slowly seeing something that you thought was vital and contributed value to your life gradually wither and deteriorate until it dies. So they compared it to watching someone die of terminal cancer. That agonizing feeling of doing everything possible to try to make that person comfortable, to seek a cure, to strive and struggle, but to feel this cloud of grief following you everywhere, to the point that afterwards you realize you were grieving the whole time. And part of it is frightening because there's a feeling of powerlessness, that you as an individual can't do anything to actually solve this problem. It's just going to keep going and going. And one of the saddest parts for that interviewee was that at the end, when the church finally closed, there was this sense of relief, the same way that there might be relief after a long illness, because that person's suffering had ended. The work was over, and now it was just time to pick up the pieces and start moving on. So they can actually identify what kind of death it reminds them of. So what's interestingly happening is that people are identifying this almost as if a person had died, as if the church is a biological organism. And interesting, this is how we study it. Now this chart behind me, I have to kind of rely on other people's research. It's been done sociologically and in the church. The sources I have for this are people like Cameron Trimble, who did Piloting Church as a presentation at our regional conference in May for Horseshoe Falls, Antler Watershed, and not Waterloo Presbytery, but the Western Ontario's Waterway region. The regions are so new, I kind of mix them up with conferences and presbyteries still. But at our regional meeting in May, she shared this. I've also seen it from Reverend Paul Miller, who is the support minister in Waterloo Presbytery. He was an expert, in my opinion, on the life cycle of congregations. So when we look at the life cycle, it's kind of charted out for us in this bell curve. A new church, a birthing church, is kind of like a toddler. It's high in energy, and then eventually it's very inclusive. It wants to make friends. It wants to learn all kinds of new things and bring people in. And then it gradually starts having skills acquisition, where they build programs. As they arc upwards into sustainability and vitality, they have enough people that all those things are flowing really well. Suddenly they need to add administration to make sure that all those programs stay organized, all the energy gets utilized, people are finding a space within the culture to belong. But after a certain point at that sustainability level, as they're succeeding, they start having a definite culture. They actually have, these are our values in common, this is what defines us, and they start becoming less inclusive. And when they become less inclusive because they're saying, we look like this, and anybody that doesn't look like this doesn't necessarily belong, that's when a church starts to slowly decline. They lose energy, and eventually they will start having their programs threatened because there won't be enough people to do the work. And when that point comes, you've crossed the line of sustainability, and you're entering into the slow slide that is a dying church. The interesting thing that the data suggests is that churches at this point become really inclusive because they're desperate to get anybody in through the doors, but the only thing they're really good at is administrating. They no longer really have new programs, and they certainly don't have energy. And then at the very end, they die a natural death. They're not a biological organism. They're an institution. They're a building, but it is born and dies like a person. What people go through as individuals in that context from my interviews is that they really value their formation time. So baptism, Sunday school, youth groups, marriages, the birth of their own children, they look at these things as inherently giving them values and skills that they can take with them to any context, and a relationship with God that builds to a certain point and that they describe afterwards as stable and comforting. So God is with them no matter what happens after a certain point of faith formation. And they value all of that time together. But when a church starts to decline and they become aware of it, it becomes a period of increasing stress. The more involved they are, the more committees they serve on, the more work they're doing. People take on tasks to try to make the building thrive and survive, knowing that there's a slide, and increasing that sense of hopelessness and grief that we talked about before. So they report that their quality of life actually deteriorates. More on that later, because they report that after closure, quality of life begins to return to normal. My interviewees, by discussing things with them, I learned several mitigating factors. Your ability to tolerate transition, to find a new context, to be able to get involved at a new church, increased with certain factors. The more transitions you'd already experienced. For instance, if you've been away for college or university, you've been to multiple sites, like different congregations, you've moved around a lot, if you've gotten married and left, returned, had children, come back, the more you are used to change, the more you could tolerate this particular change. And included in that is people's age. The younger people were, the more open they were to new experience, the easier time they had to moving to a new context. And also they identified that the more extroverted people were, both in who they were meeting, but also in their own personalities, the easier it was to make new social connections. Common sense, the opposite of that is also true. The more somebody was in one place, the more that they only attended ever in one setting, the more emotional and social connections they have in that setting, and the less social connections they have outside of it, the more likely they were to experience it as intolerable. And then they would be more unwilling to move somewhere else. The way somebody put it was that, a 30 or 40-year-old who has kids has social motivations to go to a new place and create new relationships. But a 90-year-old just sees that as needing to start over, and they don't necessarily have the emotional energy to do that. They're not considering just starting over and getting to know new people. They're actually seeing it as, well, I was here my whole life, and I don't have another 90 years to rebuild those relationships. So there's a sense of feeling trapped. The good news, to go back to my first chart, is that after transition, respondents indicated a weight off our shoulders, that sense of relief. Their quality of life actually improves because the stress of the uncertainty and all the work they were doing is gone. And because they're reporting their relationship with God as stable, a direct and ongoing comfort, they see their moral upbringing as a value that carries into the rest of their lives. I think this is extremely important because in the rural contexts that I've worked in, certainly, whenever there's a feeling of decline, people mention that they feel like they would be faithless to close, that they would in some way be disappointing God or their parents or their grandparents for closing the place that those people had invested so much time and effort into. There's this sense of, I'll be letting people down. And what my respondents showed uniformly, every single person I interviewed, was that their relationship with God still exists after closure. People's faith, people's love with God is not threatened by this event. And I think that's important to know, that it's not the end of the world. It's not a calamity. It's just something that happens and happens quite naturally. And this fits theology. There's all kinds of sources that I could look at. They're in my paper as well. But I picked out some of my favorites. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's known for being one of the Lutheran ministers that stood up to the Nazi regime in Germany during World War II. He wasn't willing to accept their autocratic methods and the way that they were treating people. He felt it was unchristian. So he was arrested, put into prison, and eventually executed for not wanting to follow Hitler. And what he said out of that time of isolation, I think stays true for all of us 100 years later. This is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote. The first disciples learnt the truth of the saying that where their Lord is, there they must also be, And where they are, there also will their Lord be until the world comes to an end. Everything the disciple does is part of the common life of the church of which he is a member. And I would say he or she. That is why the law which governs the body of Christ is that where one member is, there the whole body is also. There is no department of life in which the member may withdraw from the body, nor should they desire so to withdraw. Wherever we are, whatever we do, happens in the body, in the church, in Christ. So in Bonhoeffer's imagination, in his faith, he sees that individuals are always Christian. You were once a Christian, always a Christian, regardless of setting, regardless of context. And that's what my respondents are indicating, that sure, they might not necessarily go to church as often or at all in some cases. They don't have the social connection to a group, but they still have a relationship with God. And that really shouldn't be a surprise to us if we really think about our faith in the context of the Bible. So even older than Bonhoeffer, if we go back almost 2,000 years, this is what Paul the Apostle wrote to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 38 to 39. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. This is what people are living through. This is what people experience. And that is where hope comes from, that we don't have to feel like we're finished just because a building closes. So to go back to that first chart about the life cycle of a church, I don't know how visible it is, but I've popped in a little arrow. Every single person that I interviewed indicated that it probably would have been easier to address closure before the church was dying, to see the signs of decline, to see the signs of demographic shift, because there's so much stress in doing the work. It would be more helpful to have more people participating. So they'd like to see that during decline is when things should close, not in the last possible gasps. And just to put in that perspective, like, you wouldn't want to plan your funeral the day you were dying. Ideally, you've picked out a plot and chosen things about the service ahead of time so your loved ones know what your wishes are. And I use that as the analogy because one story that I heard was a woman and her husband had to take over their church cemetery towards the end because the caretaker that had been there for decades developed dementia and didn't pass on any of their knowledge about what to do, how to do it. So they ended up burying congregants with absolutely no training, and then they had to learn how to fill out the appropriate paperwork with the proper authorities. So just imagine that you've lived your whole life in a church, you love it, you take for granted that it's always going to be there, and then one day you actually have to start burying the people you know, and you don't know how, because the person who knew how never taught anybody. And that's actually kind of a universal problem, is that we're not teaching the skills that we've learned with a lifetime of experience to other people. We're not doing a good job of mentoring new Christians into faith. And so by analogy, this is what's causing this, and that's why they recommend closing sooner. So they identified best practices, things that helped them endure transition, or things they would have liked to have seen in the cases where they didn't have it. So the first one, as I just said, was planning ahead of the decline and closing sooner. It just alleviates the stress on everyone. Learning about congregational life cycles helped people to know that this is a demographic shift, that this is cultural. It's not necessarily where you can point a finger at a particular minister, a particular congregant. I think a lot of people get into a sense of blame that they're letting people down. This is just the situation we're in. We need to start thinking more clearly about what to do about it instead of letting grief consume us. So to know that it's not our fault kind of takes away some of that pressure. Another thing that helps pressure is visiting and being visited by other congregations and ministers more frequently to increase a sense of social connection. If you've been in one place your entire life, you don't necessarily feel like you're part of a denomination or a social group outside of the building. To actually make those connections, build them, makes it easier to kind of have a lifeline and pull out of this vortex of suffering and realize, oh, I still have other options. This isn't the end of the world. And to help with that tone, they acknowledge that people need to be more celebratory in church. Celebrate anniversaries. Celebrate the important days. Be grateful for worship. Say, this is the last time we'll have Christmas. This is the last time we'll share Easter together. But make it a celebration of the life together using memories, stories, photographs, mementos of the church. It changes the tone from something funereal and gloomy to something where we accomplished something. We're closing a chapter. We're moving on to a new one. It creates a sense of vitality and purpose. And that's what people identified, is that church gave them a sense of purpose. But once they were fighting to save the building, they didn't really know what to do next. So this is where we move into interpretation and insights. These are my observations from having gone through these interviews, from having to talk to people and then evaluated for themes and looking for like the core essence of the experience. So I kind of feel like this is where I should pause in the presentation and say the opinions expressed by the presenter aren't necessarily those of the United Church of Canada, the Atlantic School of Theology, my professor, or North Bromley. This is just purely Gavin Williams trying to make sense of the data. So because respondents report that some people try to maintain social connections, they'll go to reunions, those gradually peter out. They'll try to stay in touch with some people, but gradually life just gets too busy. You start seeing people just at funerals. One person said that 95% of the time, and I use air quotes because that's not a real statistic, this isn't quantitative data, but in her opinion, 95% of the time, she lost track of the former congregation. Like everyone she knew, everyone she thought she had deep relationships with, vanished. They just moved on with their lives. Their grief is not in losing those social connections. It's not because I don't see those people every Sunday. They identified that these people felt like church family when they were there. There was lots of hugs, lots of affection. They've grown up together. They've seen each other once or twice a week for their entire lives. But once those people are gone, they're not talking about missing Tom, Dick, or Harry, Sally, Mary, Sam. They miss the building. They are not trying to save people. They are trying to save a building, as if the building is the person that they're mourning. That's the person that they lost. The context. And I found that very interesting, that was basically what everyone said. There's some sense of missing some role models, missing some mentors, but the real grief is losing the place. And they acknowledge that this is mostly sentimentality. The building is where they were baptized, possibly, where they were raised, certainly, where they might have been married and had kids. The mementos and artifacts of the space are things that they're emotionally attached to. They also describe the routine and pattern of socializing with fellow congregants during worship, during committee meetings, the work of bazaars, bake sales, outreach projects. These things are social. And afterwards, they report that their relationship with God is stable. I had one respondent point out that that didn't really actually make sense to her. If those are just social connections and then they vanish because you make new social connections, the relationship with God is stable. The thing that might have had a different outcome for the congregation if they had emphasized spiritual connections over social ones. So for instance, she cited that at her new congregational setting, she'd been enjoying book studies and Bible studies that made her confront her own spiritual nature as a person and her relationship with God, to actually look at it as this is a person that I need to get to know and know more about and share my feelings and experience with and have that kind of communication. And that was a new concept to her because they'd been so busy doing the social work of, the latest fundraiser. So if a considerable time, energy, and resources are going into maintaining a building, and the building is what is mourned, this is a place-centered experience of faith, and it results in a period of grieving, followed by relief. Quality of life decreases with the stress of maintenance, but improves after closure. So this is a temporary thing. I would suggest that an alternative approach might reduce that stress and then actually possibly prevent it from happening if we had more God-centered modes of learning how to go to the world as the church instead of, I go to church. And I very carefully on this slide use a difference, capital C church instead of small c church. Small c church is when you think of a building, a congregation, a particular context as the church. Biblically, that's not true. Biblically, the church is the body of Christ. It is a biological organism. It's made up of people. In 1 Peter, I think it is, we're described as living stones. The living stones that build the church where God dwells. We're not a building. We are relationships and people. And to focus on that, about the spiritual connection between us instead of our individual experiences socially, I think would probably create a more sustainable environment. A word of hope. This came directly from a respondent, one of the people I interviewed. We're pretty sure that, like the phoenix, the church will revitalize itself, but it's going to be different, fundamentally different. The joke that she made, she said she had a kind of a black sense of humor. She'd have to watch at a new congregation because until people get to know her, they might not get that she's kidding around. She said, Gavin, you just need to wait till all the old people die. That might be funny to some people. It might be insulting to others, but that was where she was coming from, that she just would like to see people realize that there's more to this. I would put it in different terms instead of using the phoenix, which is, metaphorical and mythology. We're a resurrection faith. We believe that Jesus Christ died and rose from the dead, and his promise to us is that we will have eternal life with him, no matter what we think the vagaries and distresses of this life might offer us. We have that promise. And in a sense, what people reported was that when they closed their church, it allowed them to offer new resources to the wider church to do the necessary work of spreading the gospel. They could help create new programs and new opportunities. One lady actually described it as if that was her church's destiny, because she felt they did more in closing for the community at large than when they were focused on the building. The more they focused on the building, the less they actually reached out to its neighborhood. So what is at stake in this research, what is at stake in the current condition of our church, is that we need to find new ways of being church, embodying our faith in the world, and continue the good news of Jesus Christ, because the rest of the world is shifting and facing this kind of chaos. The thing that I've been thinking about since my presentation the first time, I talked about it a little then, and it's been more in my head ever since. I used this analogy about a glass of water. There are all kinds of glasses of water in the world. They all take different forms, different shapes. Sometimes they have handles, sometimes they're made of glass. This one's plastic. But all of them, their purpose, their essence, is to share water. Jesus describes the living water of who he is and the faith and relationship that he offers. It doesn't matter what form it comes in, what kind of structure, what kind of sanctuary, what kind of building. We need to think about how we're offering that essence and not get so stuck on place-centered, form-centered faith, but the flexibility of what the Spirit can do when we don't confine it. That's the end of my presentation. The next section is the Q&A. Unfortunately for me, the people that ask these questions can't be here today. We're retaping this. We kind of lost the first edition. So just so that people know that. The questions I have here from Q&A that I'll be answering. We recorded we did this from memory as best we could. My friend Andrew Garland from Calvary United Church, which has also been a supportive and thriving place, mentoring me through this process, asked a really helpful question. He caught that I'd said that about the ubiquity of technology, such as cell phones, has disrupted the way people communicate and connect. And he asked, do I think that cell phones and technology are the cause of the disconnect between people and social relationships? And my answer was, not really. I think that the problem with the disruptive technology that we're using is technology is a tool, the same way that this cup is a tool. It has a purpose, communication. What we use it for is what matters. So in a sense, it's a symptom that we have the Twitterverse, Facebook, the 24-hour news cycle. Technology's made it easier to communicate things, but we still have the responsibility as individuals of choosing, what do I want to communicate? Am I communicating something positive, spiritual, loving, uplifting, encouraging, useful, or am I being negative? Am I being a stress inducer for others? Am I really being responsible with how I treat my language and therefore the people around me in the environment? If I'm thinking that I'm an individual and it doesn't matter what I say and you can take it or leave it, I stop taking responsibility for the fact that how I treat people and how I communicate actually has an impact in the real world, because it certainly does. We've recorded that children today have larger senses of stress and mental health problems than they did a generation ago, because they're exposed to news and social media much faster than they used to be. So they have a greater sense of the stresses of the world and less capacity for how to mitigate them. An example I used with Andrew's question was that studies show that, for instance, if you're fascinated by cars, you actually use the part of your brain that's designed to memorize faces to memorize cars. But once you've memorized cars, you actually lose some of the ability to remember faces. So there's always a cost for what we're spending time on. You can choose to spend your time on what's positive. You can choose to spend your time on what's negative, and that will be what you communicate with your phone, but it's not your phone's fault. We still have to take responsibility as individuals for what we're trying to communicate. One question was about the life cycle chart that we shared there. If the life cycle chart, it shows that planting a new church requires energy and initiative, and that energy is gradually lost after the period of stability. Do you think churches past that sustainability point can restart that energy and find new directions? And I said, it takes a lot of work. You have to have people that are really committed to being energetic and creative, to wanting to do something new, to saying the form that we're in needs to take a new shape, but our essential values still matter enough to communicate. And every congregation kind of has to measure, do we have the energy to reinvent ourselves? Because there's a life cycle, it indicates that a lot of people don't put time intentionally into that kind of process. That doesn't make it impossible. It just means you have to invest the time and the social capital with people, because it's not so much about money as it is about people's energy and level of commitment. And he had a follow-up question. This was Barry Hill, also from Calvary and also from Hamilton. He kind of visits different church sites. He said, what do you say to churches contemplating things like amalgamation? I don't necessarily say anything to churches contemplating amalgamation. That would be outside the scope of my research. But what my interviewees said to me was that they found amalgamation a really difficult process. One person compared it using this kind of it's like a mother or an extended family member to be in a church. A church has a particular culture, and it's one church family. When you're amalgamating, you're trying to merge two different church families. They have different language, they have different values, they have different ways of expressing those things. And to try to figure out whose values get to take priority in this conversation can be really difficult. So it's not impossible. Again, it takes a lot of effort. But one of them suggested, if you try to get in-laws and your family together, it can be really awkward and really strange. Sometimes you need a therapist. Sometimes you need a mediator. And because of that level of work, some of the stats show it's easier to start over than it is to try to merge two things that already have momentum. Alison Mickulin, one of my classmates, came to the presentation. She asked a very helpful question because one of her emphases in her research has been on evangelism and church growth. So she asked, since given that so many of the nature of congregation seems to be rooted in social connection, is there an opportunity for evangelism among people who have seen congregations close? And I would say yes. That's the simple answer. Because people are driven to go to church because they have relatives there, friends there, connections they've already made. That's the best way to get people into the building, is through social connections. That if you wanted to reach out to people you know at congregations that have closed, because you are their friend, because you have relationships, you could certainly bring them into yours with effort. That's one of the reasons why the respondents themselves identified that when they had been visited by other congregations, when they had seen other churches, when that effort to make connections had been made, it made it easier to make transitions. So I think if we intentionally, as a church, if we were in a geographic location close by other churches and heard that they were struggling, if we started working together as a denomination, as a functioning, extended family, instead of working in isolation, it would be probably easier to alleviate each other's concerns and to build connections such that if one had to close, it would be easier to do those merging kind of things. Dwayne Whitty, one of my hosts here at North Bromley, he has studied the necessity of how to make a church thrive and grow, and also to revamp and also look at church closures. He's more of an expert on this than I am in his role as consultant. He asked a very insightful emotional question, I think. He's asked, what was the most disturbing thing you heard from interviewees? And I think because we're dealing with people's hearts, this was the most insightful thing. We could talk about strategy all day. We could talk about stats, best practices. But this is a chance to give voice to the voiceless and hear people who are often overlooked. And they shared really personal things. And I'm not at liberty to share their personal stories. But personally, for me, the most disturbing thing to hear was when people were first asked, what happened to your quality of life during closure? They would say, oh, it didn't change. And then they would pause, and they would list all the ways it actually got worse. So it did change. And the reason that I said it didn't change because after closure and after the relief set in, after they started moving on, it went back to normal. So if we could imagine quality of life was here, it deteriorated and went back up, they kind of feel like it was steady all the way across. And they also say, hearteningly, that the relationship with God stayed stable. That frightened me to hear in the sense that if you hadn't had that period of decline, would your quality of life actually have improved? If we hadn't had this really detrimental, stressful thing, you wouldn't have come out normal, you might have actually increased. And ideally, your relationship with God should increase. I don't know about other people's relationships, but my relationship with my wife, my relationship with my friends, my children, it increases and deepens over time. It can often become more challenging. It can also certainly become more fulfilling. There's a sense that life is organic and dynamic. It's always moving. If it's staying the same, it means you're actually stagnating. And so what we have done as a denomination, as congregations, by not addressing this issue of what to do during church closure, of what it's like for people, we've actually caused people's quality of life and faith to stagnate and hold still. And people that hold still like that, usually it means they've experienced trauma in any other sphere. So really what's happening in churches is people are experiencing trauma and need to heal from it. If we could start preventing that trauma ahead of time, that would be ideal. But even afterwards, we should probably still doing better pastoral care. I think that's the end of my questions that I could actually remember. Some of them were outside the scope of my research. There was a really insightful one from George Sticky. He asked, given that the decline started in the 1960s, would I be able to say anything about whether or not that was tied to the introduction of the new curriculum and the fact that there hasn't been a curriculum for spiritual development in the United Church since? That's way outside the things that I researched. It wasn't a question with any of my interviewees. But part of what I would like to say to that is school curriculums change. English, math, science, all of those things have been revamped, every 10 years for the last 50 years. As a United Church, we probably would want to look at, do we need a curriculum for Sunday schools, youth groups, confirmation classes, catechism? How do we introduce people to faith? Because universally, every single interviewee said that their faith formation is a value that matters to them even now, years later. It's one of the things they hold on to, even through their grief, is how much that meant to them. Sunday school, youth groups, the relationships they built, getting married, those initial stages of being introduced to the life of faith are what counts. So I think if we could collectively get together and say what really matters in that time period and how do we teach people what it means to be a Christian, what it means to belong to the United Church of Canada, I think that would only benefit us. And that's all I got to say about that.